The day I got the promotion I had been working toward for 4 years, I sat in my car in the parking garage underneath my office building and I cried. Not from joy, not from relief, not from the specific exhaustion of someone who has finally crossed a finish line they have been running toward for a long time. I cried from something I did not have a name for yet. Something that felt like grief, but could not have been grief because I had just been given exactly what I asked for, and grief requires a loss, and I had not lost anything. I had won. That was the problem. I had won, and the winning felt like nothing, and the nothing felt like everything. And I sat there in the parking garage with the engine off and the hazard lights blinking for some reason I cannot explain, and I thought something I had never let myself think before. Is this it? Not is this all there is, which is the dramatic version of the question, the version that sounds like a midlife crisis or an ungrateful woman who does not know how good she has it. Just is this it, quietly, genuinely, as an honest question with no predetermined answer. Because I had been told in the way we are all told things without ever being explicitly told them that this was the destination. The career with the title and the salary and the window office on the 14th floor. The apartment I had decorated carefully over 3 years until it looked like a place where someone intentional and successful lived. The relationship that was stable and adult and functional in all the ways that relationships on paper are supposed to be functional. The savings account, the gym membership I actually used, the dinner parties where I served food I had learned to cook from YouTube tutorials because that was the kind of person I was building myself into, competent and cultured and assembled correctly. I had assembled myself correctly and I was sitting in a parking garage crying and I did not know why, and that not knowing was the most frightening thing that had ever happened to me. More frightening than any of the hard things I had actually survived. The early years of working for nothing, the relationships that had ended badly, the apartment I shared with 4 people before I could afford to share it with one. Those things had been hard in ways I could name and map and move through. This was hard in a way that had no edges and no cause and no solution I could research my way to. I went back upstairs. I accepted the congratulations. I let my manager take a photograph in front of the window, and I smiled in it with my whole face because I had learned, over years of professional performance, how to smile with my whole face in situations that required it. I went home and I opened a bottle of wine I had been saving for exactly this occasion, and I poured a glass and I stood in my carefully decorated apartment, and I looked at my life and I felt nothing that matched the occasion. I felt instead a strange and clarifying calm. The kind of calm that arrives not when everything is fine, but when something that has been quietly wrong for a long time finally becomes impossible to ignore. I had been ignoring it for years, not deliberately, not with the conscious effort of someone who knows what they are avoiding, with the more insidious inattention of someone who is too busy executing the plan to ask whether the plan is actually hers. The plan had been installed so gradually and so completely that it had started to feel like a preference rather than an inheritance. Go to a good school, get a good job, build the life that looks like success from the outside, and hope that the inside catches up eventually. I had done all of it, the inside had not caught up. And standing in my apartment with a glass of wine I had been saving for 4 years, I understood for the first time that it was not going to. Not because I had failed, because the plan had never been designed to make me feel alive. It had been designed to make me feel safe, which is a different thing entirely, and I had confused the two for so long that the confusion had become structural, built into the architecture of everything I had chosen and everything I had worked for and everything I had been congratulated for. By people who loved me and wanted good things for me and had no idea that the good things they wanted were not the things I actually needed. I did not quit the next day. I want to be clear about that because this is not a story about impulsive rebellion or romantic destruction of a perfectly adequate life. I stayed for 8 more months. Not because I was afraid, though fear was part of it. Because I needed to be sure. I needed to know the difference between a bad week and a wrong life, between temporary burnout and something more fundamental, between needing a vacation and needing a completely different relationship with the question of what my days were for. I started asking the question differently. Not what do I want to achieve, but what do I want my ordinary Tuesday to feel like? Not what does success look like, but what does a good day actually contain? Not what will impress the people whose opinions I have been organizing my life around, but what would I choose if no one was watching and nothing was at stake except the quality of my own experience of being alive? Those questions were dangerous. I want to warn you about that. They are dangerous not because they lead somewhere bad, but because they lead somewhere honest, and honesty about what you actually want, when it diverges significantly from what you have been building, requires you to make decisions that other people will not always understand. The first conversation I had to have was with myself, and it was the hardest one. Not because I did not know what I wanted to say, but because saying it out loud, even just internally, even just in the privacy of my own mind at 6 in the morning before the day had started and the performance had begun, meant that I could no longer pretend I had not said it. There is a particular safety in not articulating the thing you know, as long as it stays formless, as long as it exists as a feeling rather than a sentence, you can still choose not to act on it. The moment it becomes words, it becomes real. And the moment it becomes real, it becomes a responsibility. And I had been avoiding that responsibility with the same discipline I applied to everything else in my life, which is to say, very effectively and at significant cost. The sentence, when it finally formed, was not dramatic. It was not, I am miserable or I am wasting my life or any of the things that would have made the decision feel more urgent and therefore more justified. It was simply, this is not mine. The career was not mine. Not in the sense that I had not worked for it, I had worked for it harder than I had worked for almost anything, but in the sense that the desire for it had never originated in me. It had originated in a set of values and expectations and cultural scripts that I had absorbed so early and so completely that I had never thought to examine whether they fit. They did not fit, they had never fit. I had just been very good at wearing them. The relationship ended before the job did, and I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because it is the part that is most vulnerable to misinterpretation. He was not wrong for me in any of the obvious ways. He was kind and present and genuinely invested in my happiness, or rather in what he understood my happiness to be, which was the same thing I had understood my happiness to be until I had started asking different questions. When I began asking different questions, the answers I was getting no longer fit inside the life we were building together, and I tried for a long time to find a version that was compatible. And I could not find it, and eventually I had to be honest about that. The conversation was quiet and long, and nothing like the conversations that happen in movies when relationships end. No single devastating revelation, no villain, no victim. Just two people who had wanted the same things until one of them changed what she wanted, and the other had built his entire future around the version of her that existed before the change. I moved out of the apartment on a Saturday in February, and I put everything I owned into a storage unit, and I moved into a room in a house with two people I did not know, and I sat on the floor of that room the first night surrounded by a single suitcase and a box of books. And I felt something I had not felt in so long, I had almost forgotten it was available to me. I felt like myself, not the assembled version, not the version I had been constructing and maintaining and presenting to the world for the past decade, just me. In a room with a suitcase and some books and no idea what came next and no performance required. I stayed in that room for 4 months. They were the most clarifying 4 months of my life. I read things I had not given myself permission to read because they were not useful in any professional sense. I cooked badly and experimentally and without any reference to what the result would look like from the outside. I had conversations with my two housemates that went nowhere in particular and lasted 3 hours and left me feeling more nourished than any of the networking dinners I had attended in the previous 4 years. I slept without an alarm when I could. I walked without a destination when the weather allowed. I started writing badly at first and then less badly, not for any audience, but because the writing was how I processed what was happening and what had happened, and what I was slowly beginning to understand about the distance between the life I had been living and the life I actually wanted. What I was slowly beginning to understand was this: the American dream, or at least the version of it I had been handed, was not a dream in any meaningful sense of the word. A dream is something that comes from inside you, something generated by your own desires. What I had been living was a blueprint drawn by people who were not me, for a life that was not designed with my particular interior in mind, and handed to me so early and with such confidence that I had never thought to ask who the architect was. The blueprint was not malicious. The people who handed it to me loved me. They wanted good things for me. They identified the path that seemed to lead most reliably toward safety and stability and social legibility, and they had pointed me toward it with best intentions. But best intentions are not the same as accurate knowledge of another person's soul and what it requires to feel at home in a life and in a body and in a set of days that are, in the end, the only days you are going to get. I started building something different, not in opposition to what I had left, not as a statement or a rejection or a manifesto about the failures of conventional ambition, just something that fit, something that had been designed from the inside out rather than the outside in. Something that asked first, what do I actually value, and built outward from that answer, rather than asking, what does success look like, and working backward from that image. It was slower, it was less legible to the people around me. It was occasionally frightening in the specific way that things are frightening when they have no guarantee and no precedent and no one in your immediate circle who has done anything similar. But it was mine, and that ownership changed the texture of every ordinary day. What she found on the other side was not paradise. I want to be honest about that because the version of this story that gets told most often has a clean and photogenic ending, a cottage somewhere green, a creative business that funds itself effortlessly. That is not what I found. What I found was messier and quieter and more sustaining than anything a clean ending could contain. I found work that was harder to explain at dinner parties, but easier to wake up for. I found a slower pace that eventually felt like sanity. I found relationships that were built on who I actually was rather than who I was performing. And the difference in the quality of being known was so significant that I could not believe I had mistaken the previous version for intimacy. I found mornings that belonged to me. I found the specific pleasure of being interested in something for no reason except that it genuinely interested me, with no calculation of how it would look on a resume or a social media profile or in the estimation of people whose opinions I had organized my life around. I found difficulty that felt meaningful rather than difficulty that felt arbitrary. That distinction matters more than I can say. Both lives contained hard things. Both required sacrifice and discipline and the navigation of uncertainty. But in the old life, the hard things felt like a toll I was paying to maintain a position I was not sure I wanted. In the new life, the hard things felt like the actual texture of building something real, the resistance that tells you the thing you are making is worth making. The friction that comes not from moving in the wrong direction, but from moving at all. I am not telling you to do what I did. I want to be clear about that because this is not a prescription. I did not reject the American dream because it is wrong. I rejected it because it was not mine. And the invitation I'm extending to you is not to reject yours, but to examine it. To ask, seriously and without the comfortable deflection of busyness, whether the life you are building was designed by you or inherited from someone else's idea of what your life should look like, to ask whether the metrics you are using to measure your own success were chosen or absorbed, to ask whether the things you are working toward are things you actually want, or things you have wanted for so long you have stopped questioning the origin of the wanting. Those questions are not comfortable. They were not comfortable for me, but they were the most important questions I have ever asked. And the life I am living now, imperfect and unfinished and not easily photographed, is the most honest answer I have ever given.